It's time for our special interview here on Morning Wave in Busan. Let me ask you this. How much sleep do you get? Or rather, how much sleep should you be getting? You might have heard of the typical standard reply, 7 to 8 hours. But what happens if we don't hit those 7 to 8 hours? Let's find out more about how to sleep for success with Dr. Rebecca Robbins, sleep researcher at the NYU School of Medicine. She's also the co-author of Sleep for Success. Hi, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So it seems that researchers from NYU School of Medicine reviewed more than 8,000 websites to identify the 20 most common assumptions about sleep. So if you can tell us about this bit of research.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is our most recent publication, and we summarized in this study the most common, actually what we'll call sleep myths, or things that people believe to be true, but aren't necessarily true when we look at the scientific literature. So in that paper, we got together the most, the worst offenders when it comes to myths about sleep.
Yes.
And those range from questions that people have, or maybe myths that people believe in the duration of sleep. So some people, for instance, we find here in the U.S., believe that they can get by on less than 5 hours of sleep at night. But unfortunately, all of the evidence shows that to the contrary. This is not true, that the vast majority, maybe there's a small minority, but the vast majority of us do need between 7 and 8 hours for optimal health and optimal alertness. A few of the other myths that we found to be commonly held among adults in the U.S. were beliefs that drinking alcohol is a good way to help you fall asleep. We call this a nightcap here in the U.S. And it's very common, but it really is an old wives' tale. It is a myth. Alcohol is one of the worst things, unfortunately, we can do before sleep. Alcohol will virtually keep pulling you out of the deeper stages of sleep at night. So your body may get sleep, but it won't be the restorative sleep that allows us to wake up and really be at our best.
Well, that's so interesting, especially in terms of, the belief that getting less than 5 hours of sleep is okay. In Korea, there's like a kind of this saying that if you get 4 hours of sleep, you'll pass an exam. 5 hours of sleep and you might fail. So clearly that is a misconception, right?
Oh, no. Well, it would be fun to do this study in Korea and debunk some of the myths that Koreans have about sleep. And, essentially, the reason we want to do this is we want to promote what we call evidence-based beliefs. So we want people to be empowered with the truth and with what we know to be effective when it comes to sleep and health and well-being. Yes.
Well, in terms of sleep, I'm very curious. This is actually a personal question I have. Some people seem to think that, let's say during the work week, you might be deprived a little bit of, you might not get the 7 to 8 hours that you're supposed to get. Can you, quote and unquote, make up for that sleep on the weekend?
Now, this was another one of our myths.
Oh, really? Okay.
So, unfortunately, that is a myth. It's a very common practice, though, among, it sounds like it might be something that you do. I'm guilty of it. But the biggest group where this is a problem is teenagers. Because teenagers have a really hard time falling asleep at, we'll say a quote-unquote early bedtime, around 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. And we have some physiological data to back that up. So teenagers, there's actually a change that happens in the teenage brain so that teenagers are optimally tired much later into the wee hours of the morning. And then they have to wake up and go to school. And then all of that is pit against the huge pressure on kids in high school to get into college and all of that. So it's very common among teenagers to have a very short sleep schedule during the school week, and then what we will call kind of binge sleep, or sleep for 8, 9, 10, 12 hours on the weekend. Now, the reason this is not good for us, and we have some data to back this up, but when we, quote unquote, sleep in, what you're doing there, of course, is delaying your rising time.
Sure.
So if you you wake up at 7 o'clock, say, during the work week, and then you'll wake up at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock on the weekends. What that does is it puts your body into kind of prep mode for jet lag. So your body is kind of cued to be transitioning to a new time zone, believe it or not, when you shift that much later than your normal time. So that's the reason, and this might sound familiar to you.
Yes.
This is the reason that we, if you sleep in and you wake up and you're refreshed, after that late, indulgent sleeping in.
Yes.
But then that night, especially if it's a Sunday night and you have to get up the next morning at your regular time, you are going to toss and turn and probably have some insomnia. And there's nothing worse. You're going to start that week off on a really rough foot. So the best advice is to keep your sleep schedule as consistent as possible.
I see.
Really, because our bodies are really creatures of habit. So when we vary much more than an hour or two, really, it's very hard for our bodies to understand when they should be tired and when they should be alert.
Right. So you already mentioned, a nightcap, drinking alcohol before sleep. That's a myth. It's not a good thing. But what about, I remember when I was younger, my mom used to warm up some milk for me if I was, on a school night, couldn't get to bed as early as I was supposed to. Is anything like that helpful at all?
This is a really good question. Now, we do know that eating or drinking a lot before bed is not ideal, but we do anecdotally hear a lot of case histories and stories like that.
Yes.
And we believe it's soothing for your sleep, a glass of milk in particular, if you were raised in that way. So if your parents gave you a glass of milk. And so there it transcends, the glass of milk. It's really soothing because it brings you back to, lovely childhood memories. So it's not necessarily something we would, recommend. But if that works for you and that's something that you and your family have done for many years, then we certainly, say, if it's not broken, don't fix it.
I see. Well, oftentimes when people can't fall asleep, you hear about, flipping the TV, the remote on and flipping through the channels, or nowadays, of course, everybody's glued to their smartphones. How do smartphones and TVs affect our sleep?
In a big way. So we do have some evidence that people, frankly, myself included, I'm guilty of this sometimes, because we live busy lives, and it's almost as though technology has created more more time and more things to do. It's a kind of irony, but it's so tempting to be on these devices because they're always on, and there are always people posting content. And so there's the reason that screens, whether it's a mobile phone or a laptop or a computer, aren't great for us. There's several reasons. The first is what you're likely doing on these platforms, on these devices, is stimulating. Either you're doing work, which is, raising your heart rate, maybe stressful, maybe pulling you away from all the things that we should be doing before bed, which are really powering down and starting to prepare the mind and the body for sleep. So number one, they're stimulating, but number two, they also emit bright blue daylight spectrum light.
Yes.
Now, that spectrum, that color spectrum is actually very important, because colors that are in the blue section of the color spectrum, those types of colors, very bright blues, those are what trigger our body to become awake, because they mirror the sun. And so that brightness actually is a physiological cue that we've developed over hundreds of years. And that cue is what triggers the awake phase of our circadian rhythm.
Sure.
So a lot of cell phones, a lot of devices emulate that color temperature. So for that reason, the screens that emit these bright blue lights aren't ideal. Now, there are ways to kind of to dampen that bright blue light.
Sure.
So there's an app on some Android devices called Flux, Flux.
Yes.
Then on the iPhone, there's the night shift program, and essentially these apps will start to dampen the color of your screen, so it's not bright blue, but instead it's a warmer hue.
I see.
It's a red, it's a yellow. Now those can be better, but again, overall, that number one issue is these devices are stressful, so avoiding them as best as possible.
Right. Well, what about in terms of snoring, whether it's you or your partner? Is snoring necessarily a sign of poor health, and does it interfere with sleep?
This is a great question, and this was also covered in our myths paper.
Okay.
Because we found that a lot of the adults that we assessed and kind of and surveyed in this study, we found a lot believed actually that snoring was a sign of good sleep. So if you're snoring, then that's a sign that you're really getting deep sleep. But to the contrary, snoring, it's not always negative. It certainly is negative for a bed partner.
Yes.
But snoring that is very loud and interrupted by pauses in breathing over the course of sleep at night. Now, this is where we do start to worry, because that is indicative of the most worrisome sleep disorder called sleep apnea.
Right.
There are actually 89 differentially diagnosable sleep disorders, but sleep apnea is the most worrisome. Sleep apnea patients suffer from many, many nighttime awakenings over the course of the night. They wake up and they're absolutely exhausted. So loud snoring interrupted by pauses in breath is very concerning and should be treated by a medical professional, your general physician or a sleep specialist. But by and large, you really hit the nail on the head, Catherine, because sometimes snoring, it's harmless, but it really isn't to the bed partner. So in that case, find maybe a way to get rest and maybe get your partner to not snore. We do know that snoring is less frequent and not quite as loud if you sleep on your side.
Right.
So finding a way to get the person onto their side. There's some pillows that do this.
Yes.
So all of those are good strategies.
I wish we had 2 more hours, but for a final question, what do you recommend then in terms of being mindful and healthy with our sleep? What do you recommend?
We've already covered a lot of great points. Number one, making time for sleep, making sure that you have at least 7 hours of time for sleep is critical. The other piece that we touched on briefly, but it's so important, is consistency of bedtime schedules. Finding a time that you can fall asleep and wake up, and keeping those times as close to the same from Monday to Monday will really allow your body to really understand well when it's supposed to be tired and when it's supposed to be alert. Now, the third strategy is often practiced by the children in our population, but I think we have a lot to learn from them, is a bedtime routine. So finding a set of strategies, whether it's reading for a couple pages in a book, doing something for yourself, because so often our careers can really, take hold, and although they're great things in many ways, they're important to power down to give you a little bit of, peace, to start to prepare that body before sleep and quiet the mind. So starting a bedtime ritual, whether it's reading or taking a shower, can also be a really great strategy.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some great tips in terms of getting better sleep for better health. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was Dr. Rebecca Robbins, sleep researcher at NYU and co-author of Sleep for Success.